Hello, my name's Rory. I'm the Methodist minister in Haxby and Wigginton, and also part of the ministry team at Central Methodist Church in York. And welcome to my slightly chaotic study. Whether you've been here before or not, this has been my workplace for about the last 4 months. And this series, What is the Bible and What's Inside, is one of the things that I'm doing during this time to create some conversation, to put out some resources, to give people an opportunity to explore faith and life and the universe and everything and how they fit together. So this is the 6th session of what will be, I think, 9 sessions in total. We've spent 5 weeks zipping through the Old Testament in about 2.5 hours, not 2.5 hours each time, but about half an hour each time. We've had a look through all of the Old Testament, and today we start on the New Testament with the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Because I'm taking about half an hour to go over a major section of the Bible, I'm not going to be spending a huge amount of time drilling down into detail. And the purpose of this set of talks is not so much to look at them from the point of view of faith and to ask what they mean for people of faith or how we use them in the church, but to look at them as pieces of literature, to ask how the Bible came to be as it is. And who do we think wrote it? And at what period in history? And what was going on around them? And a little bit of that conversation is about how those books came to be part of the Bible today. So today we're not going to be spending a lot of time looking in detail at the content of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, but really looking at them in terms of their composition, their chronology, the order in which we find them, how we deal with the fact that in at least 3 of them we find lots of material almost word for word. In the others, how scholars and those who've studied scripture as a piece of literature in biblical studies have made sense over the years of these 4 accounts of the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, even though Mark's gospel, as I'll say later on, doesn't necessarily help us to understand the resurrection very much. So there you are. About half an hour, and I hope this is interesting. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. So 4 different versions of the same story, in some ways quite different from each other. I want to say right up front, we are absolutely clear in the world of scholars, not that I would plonk myself into that kind of company, but scholarship with regards to the dating of the authorship of these books states almost unequivocally that they were not written by the disciples of Jesus, called Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. They are just too old for that to have been the case. I mean, what I mean by that is they come too late after the story of Jesus in the chronology of that time. The earliest evidence means that these disciples would probably have died sometime before that. We're quite sure of that. The oldest fragments of scrolls and text that we have are at best 3rd generation copies. So none of them original, but at best 3rd generation copies. And the most reliable full versions of several of the Gospels are really only found in literature that dates from about the 4th century. So we do need to speculate as to how they came to be in the final form that they are, and how true they are to their original context. So I'm going to talk first about something called the synoptic problem, and I'll explain that in a moment, and then look at each of the Gospels in turn, just very briefly, and look at what we think about who wrote it and how they fitted that together. But I want to begin with just reflecting on the fact that Matthew, Mark and Luke have lots in common that John does not. And that's not just about content, but about style, about wording, about emphasis. And in Matthew, Mark and Luke's gospel, we find enough material in common, lots of material in common, so much so that for many, many years, for well over a century now, we've been wrestling with what is called, in scholarly terms, the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem. And that really has to do with a number of things. It has to do with priority. Which of these Gospels was written first? If one of the texts draws from another, then that source must have been composed first. And it is very obvious that that in Matthew, Mark and Luke's Gospels there is evidence of some of the writers drawing directly on the writings of others, which means those documents, those books, those stories must have existed in some written form before them. There's the question of what's called successive dependence. Did each of them draw on the knowledge of the predecessor? And did they come in some kind of neat chronological order, so that we can say Matthew is based largely on Luke or Mark, and then, you know what I mean, and then Luke looks at Matthew and Mark, and then John has all three but rejects them and writes other things and draws bits in. It's one of the questions. We are, of course, dealing with lost written sources. Did any of the Gospels draw from some earlier document? Was there something, not just in the fact that we only have third generation copies, but was there even something written down before them that all of them use, in whatever order they come afterwards, to tell the story? Or do we have the oldest of the Gospels, which we presume to be Mark, for all kinds of good reasons? Was that a fresh and new telling of the story? There are also oral sources. To what extent did each of the evangelists, or each of those who were a literary collaborator or writer, how did they contribute from personal knowledge, from eyewitness accounts, from liturgy and the way the church was behaving and expressing itself, or other oral traditions to produce the original written accounts? It's also important to say about the Gospels that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are much younger by decades than almost all of the rest of the New Testament. The fact that they come at the beginning doesn't mean that they're the oldest of those books. Paul's letters, in fact most of the letters we find in the New Testament, the bulk of the New Testament, actually originated before these Gospels were written down in any form. And then of course there's the whole question of translation. Jesus and others who of his time spoke primarily in Aramaic, but all of the texts we have are written in Koine Greek. So who performed the translations? At what point? How did they come about? And then there's the whole question of editing or redaction. How and why did those who put these Gospels into their final form, how did they expand them? How did they abridge them? How did they alter them? How did they rearrange them so that we end up with what we have now? So that's just about enough questions for half an hour or so, don't you think? But all of these are important questions because, as I'll say now and we'll say again at the end, part of what we're trying to make sense of is how trustworthy these documents are. And one of those questions is about historical accuracy. Another of those questions is about intention. And of course, some of that is about the source material that would have been used by those who wrote these books for us and what they were hoping to achieve. So, as I've said already, scholars presume that Mark is the oldest of the Gospels. It certainly reads as the most sort of primitive and unsophisticated. It has particular themes which we'll look at when we get to it. But we believe that most strongly because, well, over 90% of Mark's Gospel is found almost word for word, if not word for word, in Matthew and Luke, or Matthew or Luke, if that makes sense. So between them, they share almost verbatim big chunks of Mark, and then each of them has other little bits which come out of Mark, which the other does not. And so it seems logical that Mark was used as a primary source by the authors of Matthew and of Luke. Also that Matthew and Luke have other material which is in common. They tell stories that are only found in those two Gospels. And so it seems again obvious to ask whether the two individuals or groups of people who put Matthew and Luke into their final form, whether they had some other common source. There are over 200 verses that are common between them that are not found, even though they might be structured slightly differently, but that are not found in any of the other Gospels. Did Matthew and Luke use other material? Because again, Matthew and Luke both have material that's unique to Matthew or to Luke. They both tell stories, they both recount teachings, they both tell of events in the life of Jesus that are not found in any of the other Gospels. And so it seems that they had Mark, they had something else that was in common, and then each of them had what scholars call secret Matthew and secret Luke as sources. And whether those were oral sources or written sources, we don't know. We don't know. But we can see that they had things that were in front of them that they shared with each other, maybe not sort of physically, obviously, but that they had in common as they prepared. And then there's a question of whether Luke uses Matthew. That's one of the theories out there. It's not a particularly popular theory, but whether Luke did not have this second source, but whether Mark was a primary source for Matthew alongside something else, and then Luke used Matthew's gospel along with the extra things that were added, left some of them out and included others. The answer is we just don't know. We can only speculate and apply logic and scholarship to the questions that I've already outlined that all go on. None of the Gospels actually say this was written by. There are allusions in John's Gospel to the beloved disciple, for example, but they're sort of allusions that, again, as a literary device, would have made sense in their day and were perfectly permissible. That authorship could be ascribed to someone in the tradition of their teaching or writing. But none of them actually say this was written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, the apostle or disciple of Jesus. And like I've said, the dating of the manuscript seems to indicate clearly that the authors were definitely not the disciples of Jesus. So I want to spend just a few minutes on each of them, each of the books in themselves, and then we can look at how we try to hold them together and what we gain from the fact of having four. Mark's Gospel, which I'll begin with because it's the oldest. Mark's Gospel is understood largely to have been written in around 70 AD, to have come into being around 70 AD, so a good 40 years beyond the death of Jesus. It seems that it might have been written for a non-Jewish Christian community. It doesn't spend very much time drawing the threads through of Jesus' Jewishness into its life. And it certainly has as a major theme within it Jesus as an agent of God, active in the physical world. Jesus is, in all of the Gospels, in Mark's Gospel, the most like a superhero. And a major emphasis of Mark's Gospel is on Jesus' power and dominion over nature. And so there are healings and the calming of storms, and it seems that Jesus' intervention physically in the world, in a spiritual and physical sense, is a hugely important theme as part of that. There's no early life in Mark's Gospel. The stories of the birth of Jesus and his childhood are captured in Matthew and Luke. They're not anywhere else. So Mark's Gospel begins with Jesus as an adult, beginning his ministry, tempted in the desert. And Mark also has a number of endings. The oldest ending that we have, based on the scrolls that have been found, actually ends quite a few verses before the modern translation that we use in churches today. It ends with the women finding the tomb empty and being afraid. But the ending we use today follows on from that and softens that a bit and has Jesus appearing to them and then and appearing to the disciples. But Mark is action from the get-go, and is clearly the source for much of Matthew and much of Luke. The Gospel of Matthew, it's believed, was finished in its present form mostly around the late 1st century after the death of Jesus. It's written for a Jewish Christian community. It seems to have, some people have thought that the purpose of Mark's Gospel is to show how powerful God is. The purpose of Matthew's Gospel is to evangelize the Jews. It's much more likely that Matthew's Gospel is written to a Jewish Christian community in a world where the church is growing, and it's growing far more in its Gentile converts than its Jewish converts. It's becoming less and less Jewish as a movement. And that Matthew's Gospel in part is written to emphasize, preserve, and hold on to the Jewish heritage that is very much part of the Messianic story. So quite a difference there as a tool for evangelism, as a tool for holding on to and remembering and solidifying in some ways the Jewishness of Jesus. Not in an exclusive way, but in a way that remembers that your Jewishness is not lost in the course of you becoming Christian. And it has an interesting structure. It has a kind of five-fold structure of narrative and then discourse. So action and then speech, and action and speech. And that repeats sort of 5 times through Matthew's Gospel. And some scholars speculate that is an attempt to, in some way, draw the Jewish community back into the Pentateuch, into the original documents that are there, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. 5 books that tell the story of how the nation of Israel was born as a nation on the cusp of entering the Promised Land. And so Matthew's Gospel has as a device the mirroring of a 5 chapters in order to do that. But again, we don't know. It's just one of the theories and one of the things that people speculate about. In Matthew's Gospel, we have the Beatitudes, which appear in their full form in Matthew, and in Luke scattered around a bit, but not all of them are there. We also have, as a major discourse in Matthew's Gospel, the Sermon on the Mount. 3 chapters of teaching in Matthew 5, 6 and 7, although of course the chapters and verses were not part of the original document. Matthew 5, 6 and 7, 3 profound chapters of social teaching ascribed to a single moment where we find that same teaching not in the same place in the chronology in Luke's Gospel, and scattered around a bit into a mixture of teachings, but capturing much of the Sermon on the Mount, which is one of the passages and one of the sections of text which scholars think Matthew and Luke must have found or got hold of or had offered to them or just knew from somewhere else, but chose to use quite differently in their telling of the story. So we come to Luke, and Luke is again late 1st century, but there's evidence that Luke as a book was revised well into the 2nd century after the death of Jesus. It is the longest of the Gospels. It is a partner to the book of Acts. It's quite clear that the author of Luke is also the author of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, which is next week's book, and we'll just be looking at the book of Acts next week because it is so foundational in the establishment of the early church and all that comes after. So Luke is sort of half of the story of a story told over 2 books. It has a very big sort of salvation history theme across the 2 books. It tries to tell the religious and political history of a nation in some ways. About a third of it is unique and not found anywhere else. And it's believed by at least one scholar that it was written to be read aloud. Written to be read aloud in a probably in a home setting as part of a small Christian community, sharing in Holy Communion or in the Lord's Supper or in the Eucharist, or however we want to describe it. As I've said, it has this overarching theme of salvation history and how the person of Jesus embodies that, brings that into being through his death and resurrection, and then the implications of that in the way that the early church is established in the book of Acts. We find more of the Holy Spirit in Luke than in any of the other Gospels. We find more evidence, more writing about the Spirit of God, which is a significant difference from some of the others. And it is believed that Luke's Gospel is Gentile-facing. In the same way that some people have thought Matthew was written for Jews, they've said Luke is written for Gentiles. But it's not necessarily the case that was the author's intent. Whereas the author of Matthew may have wanted to remind Jewish Christians that their Jewishness was not lost in the course of following Jesus. Luke wants, it would seem, to say to the Gentile community, you are not half Christian because you're not also Jewish. That there's a great emphasis on Jesus and Jesus' ministry amongst the Gentiles, and the fact of Gentiles being just as much part of God's plan as Jews. And Gentiles are just all the other people around who weren't Jewish, if that's not a phrase that you know. So Luke is really interesting because it is part of a set of two books which together make up a large proportion of the New Testament. Well over a quarter of the New Testament is just Luke and Acts. And so it's worth reading seriously those two books together as part of understanding what those who wrote them were trying to tell us about the person of Jesus and what the implications were of his life into the establishment of the church. And then we come to John's Gospel, which is a bit of a head scratcher. It's the latest in terms of dating, so it's the youngest, believed to have been written, completed about 90 to 110 AD. So while Luke was in its almost final form, probably late first century, John comes just a little bit later, and we have no idea whether the author of John had heard of or seen the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke at that point. Some people think that the author of John had all three and chose to incorporate some of the themes from them, but not the actual wording. But John is very different from the others. And John forms part of, in the New Testament, what we call the Johannine literature. So the Gospel of John, the letters of John, and then the Revelation of John, which is the very last book. And we'll spend a whole week on that in a couple of weeks' time. That those three share all kinds of structure, language, style, and content, so that they're part of maybe not one person's writing, but they're part of a kind of school of understanding, and a culture of storytelling and writing things down, and language and style that is fairly consistent across them. John was clearly written for a mixed audience. John was written for Jews and for Gentiles. There is evidence of Luke and Mark, not in the actual writing, but there is evidence in the way that John is written, and I won't go into the details of that now, because I'd need to spend some more time looking them up for a start, but also because time is against us in these sessions. There's evidence that John probably had seen at least Mark and Luke in the course of writing. And I say John because, of course, that's just the language I use, but whoever the author was, or however that the gospel is a work of collaboration. That's what we have. That's what we know. There are a few things that are different in John's Gospel. In the Last Supper, before Jesus' crucifixion, there is no Holy Communion. There's no bread and wine. There is rather the washing of the disciples' feet. There are also major discourses that come just before that in John's Gospel and elsewhere that, we don't find anywhere else. Jesus' teaching on unity, on the vine and the branches, on a number of things are unique to John's Gospel. John also is written much more to the individual than to the community, however small that community may have been, in the minds of the authors of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John has a strong emphasis on the individual person's experience of relationship with God through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And as it's also been described by many as the most sort of mystical or spiritual gospel. Again, those words need unpacking, but it is much less. There is a lot more in John's gospel that is fundamentally about ideas and beliefs and imagery than there is in the others. Not so much in the parables necessarily or sayings of Jesus. Not that Jesus paints pictures in that way, but that there's a kind of generalized sort of spirituality about John that is quite different from the other Gospels. Again, the material, the theological emphasis, the chronology, the style, those things are all very different from the other Gospels. And we scratch our heads about that and wonder why and where that came from. 24 minutes. How are we doing? Wow, we've gone quickly through quite a lot. I want to wrap up today and try and be within half an hour, because I've not been very good at that in other weeks. By simply saying that, of course, the synoptic problem is a problem, but it's not a problem in the sense of not being able to trust the Gospels necessarily. It's just that we have a number of questions that cannot be answered, and so that's the problem. There is, of course, the question of what we do with the fact that within and across the Gospels there are contradictions. There are differences in emphases. There are differences in intent. There are differences in the audience for which we believe these books were written, these stories were told. There are differences in how we think they may have come about, and how they've been edited over time, and how bits have been added to at least Mark and John's Gospels. We're quite sure. Some of the last bits of each of them have clearly come along at a later date. There's much about which we simply have to say we don't know. And so the question that we're left with then is it true? And I suppose from a faith point of view, that's an important question. And then we have to ask what truth is, or what we mean by true, and whether that's about historical accuracy. From a scholarly point of view, from a biblical studies point of view, the question isn't so much, are these accurate depictions of historical events? Although the school of historical criticism would be asking that question in some way. What we're really doing is saying, what are these pieces of literature, and where did they come from? And what purpose do we think the original author intended them to serve? And why did they craft them or structure them in the way that they did? What do we learn about the language they used in terms of their own lives, where they were, when they were there? How do we learn from the way they describe events around them, of when they might have been written in the course of the decades and centuries, or just a century beyond the birth, death and resurrection of Jesus, according to the Christian tradition, which of course you don't have to accept as part of studying these things. And we come back to, we don't know. But it is both interesting and quite fun to dip into or spend some time with the differences between them. And so if you have nothing else to do, perhaps, or because you'd like to, perhaps sit down and read Mark's Gospel for a start. And if you can read it in one sitting, or as little time as possible, not that it's a race, just that it's good to read in chunks, read as a whole rather than as little bits diced up, which is what we do in church so often. Just little windows into a much bigger passage or set of teaching. Then you might learn quite a lot about the author's intent, and about the way that Jesus is portrayed, and about the way that we look at the world through different lenses. As you look across the four Gospels, we have something in some ways similar to eyewitness accounts of different events. The same event will be described quite differently, depending on who you are, where you're standing, what angle you're standing viewing the events from, what preconceived ideas you bring into that, what judgments you make in the course of remembering, and how your brain chooses to record the detail of what you are later convinced you saw or heard. All of these are part of being human, and we should expect in the Gospels, like we should expect in all of Scripture, to encounter the humanness of the authors and the editors, for good or ill, in the best attempts that they make to remember things accurately, and in their probably quite deliberate manipulation of events into the message that they want to have us hear. We certainly saw that in the Old Testament, in large parts of it. How stories are told in a very one-sided way, for a very particular purpose, to make a very particular point about Israel's chosenness, about the lack of trust we should place in those who are foreigners. In all kinds of examples, we can point to the humanness of the authors and the editors as a reason to maybe not trust the passages, or as a reason to engage with them in a more trustworthy way. Because what we're doing is reading the stories, reflections, and outputs of people who are just like us, in that they come at life, they come at faith, they come at storytelling, they come at history, they come at describing their lives in community, through the lens of what they know, what they believe, what they experience, what they feel, and what they regard as authority in terms of the trustworthiness of other people's stories, for a start. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. They're all worth a read. None of them are long by any standard. If you put them together and you publish them as a book and you said to someone, here's a paperback to read, it would not be a big, fat, substantial thing. And so maybe part of the challenge for you and I again is to say, I'd say to myself, when last did I sit down and read any of the Gospels with any real intent for any length of time, apart from preparing for Sundays? I'm not sure. And so maybe I have some homework to do, as much as you do. But there they are. There they are. We don't know who wrote them. We don't know how they came to be in their final form. We don't know who had access to which bits of each other's. We just know that they tell the story of the person of Jesus through 4 sets of lenses. And I think we're the richer for the 4 sets of lenses, rather than some great quest to find one definitive, historical, accurate portrayal of those tumultuous years in the land of Israel and continuing today. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Again, if you want to be in touch about any of this or have any conversation further, you're very welcome to be in touch with me personally. And I'll be back next week to talk about the Book of Acts, the establishment of the early church, and some of the major themes that we find in that account. Take care. Cheers.